Antarctica is one of the most isolated and frozen continents on planet Earth. There wasn't anyone living there, just ice, snow, and freezing cold. Yet, about 3,000 meters beneath the icy wasteland of the Weddell Sea, there was a shipwreck that was hidden for over 100 years before it was finally rediscovered. The entire time, the ship was quietly sitting under 10,000 feet of freezing water, yet it remained remarkably well preserved. It still looks very similar to the day it went down, and the name of the ship, Endurance, is still clearly visible on the stern. Now, this ship was a massive vessel built for exploration. It set sail in 1914 as part of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. Their mission was really ambitious. They were to become the first expedition to cross the Antarctic continent, from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, from coast to coast.
There remained but one great main object of Antarctic journeyings:
the crossing of the South Polar continent from sea to sea.
The ship was carrying 28 men, explorers, sailors, scientists, and specialists. Each one was selected for their skills to help conquer the unknown. Now, among these people was Frank Hurley, a photographer specially hired to document this historic journey. He brought along a pocket camera and a large collection of film equipment, well prepared to capture the Antarctic crossing in a moment that hopefully would inspire the world. But tragically, the 28 men never completed their mission. On the 27th October 1915, their dream was shattered, and the crew was watching helplessly as their ship was being crushed, destroying their hope of even surviving the expedition. The order to abandon ship was shouted to the men. The pressure of 10 million tons of ice was grinding along the sides, breaking their ship with agonizing force. Now, the 28 men were completely stranded, trapped at the mercy of floating ice, and the nearest outpost of civilization was 1,200 miles away. They had no radio to call for help, and even if they did, it was 1915. There were no helicopters and no planes that could possibly help them at this time. So their situation was painfully simple. If they wanted to survive, they had to save themselves. But unfortunately, losing their ship was just the beginning. What they were about to face was far worse than any of them could have imagined. Yet, throughout this entire tragedy, Frank Hurley never stopped documenting. He captured every important moment that he could, and these films and photos ended up outliving the expedition itself, becoming the most powerful record of survival ever made. What Frank Hurley left behind slowly tells the full story: the fate of 28 men stranded in the middle of Antarctica, caught in a desperate attempt to survive.
His expedition had failed.
How would they be without the ship?
The order to abandon ship marked the end of the expedition. Their mission to cross Antarctica had completely failed. Their expedition leader was a man named Ernest Shackleton, an explorer known for his courage and leadership skills. But nothing could have prepared him for this moment. He stood and watched as 27 of his men climbed off the ship in desperation. Out on the ice, the men tried to save whatever they could, including 3 small lifeboats. But these boats were only built for short trips, not for crossing the vast Antarctic seas. So they salvaged anything that might help them survive: wood, sledges, tents, and food. Now, among the few personal items Shackleton saved from the ship was a Bible, gifted to the expedition by Queen Mother Alexandra. On the first page, she had written a personal blessing, a prayer for guidance and protection over land and sea. In moments like this, the men would need every bit of faith that they could get. Shackleton studied the maps with a few crew members, trying to find a way out. At this time, they were stuck on drifting ice, carried by the sea with no control over where they were floating. The closest land was an ice shelf near Palmer Peninsula, about 182 miles away. But the land was barren, lifeless, and empty. There was no safety, no food, and no rescue. So the only other option was Ported Island, a tiny piece of land nearly 350 miles to the northwest. Years ago, there was a small stack of supplies left behind by a previous expedition. It was a big gamble, but it was the only hope that they had. However, to get to Ported Island, they had to drag their heavy lifeboats across the frozen wasteland, across over 300 miles of harsh shifting ground, hoping that the ice would eventually break open and let them sail. But these lifeboats were not built for long journeys. They were small, open, and fragile. There was no cover for freezing winds or heavy storms. Out of the water, the waves could easily toss them around and flip the men over into the cold sea. Yet, there was no other choice. So Shackleton gathered everyone around. If they wanted to survive, they had to travel with as little as possible. Standing in the cold, Shackleton reminded the man that nothing was worth more than survival. He then pulled out a gold cigarette case and a handful of golden coins, dropping them into the snow. His message was clear: leave behind what doesn't matter. So later that day, the snow was littered with items that the man once treasured: watches, books, telescopes, and letters from home. Almost everything that wasn't useful had to be left behind, with only a few exceptions. The surgeons were allowed more medical tools, and those who kept diaries were allowed to bring them. Now, interestingly, among the crew was Leonard Hussey, a meteorologist who was well known for his banjo, an instrument that he brought to the ship that had become a source of laughter during the expedition. So, when the time came, Shackleton insisted that the banjo must come with them. He called it vital mental medicine, something to keep their spirit alive for the hard journey ahead. Then, with everything packed, the men started moving. Shackleton led the way with Worsley, Hussey, and Hudson, carving a trail through the ice with pickaxes and shovels. The men tried to look for the flattest ground, but every few hundred yards, a wall of ice blocked their way. Each time, the men had to take a path or build a snow ramp just to get the boat over the ridges. On top of that, these men were pulling sledges, carrying hundreds of pounds of supplies. The snow was soft and the boats were heavy, forcing the men to lean forward, almost flat to the ground just to keep moving. For safety reasons, Shackleton ordered the men to move in small sections, a quarter mile at a time, just in case the ice would crack beneath them. Their progress was painfully slow. Every time they pushed forward, they had to walk back to fetch the next load. After a full day, the men realized they had only moved about a mile away from the ship. It had become obvious that this was a hopeless task. The ice ahead looked even worse. So Shackleton ordered the men together and told them that, despite all the efforts, it was just not worth the trouble. It simply wasn't worth pushing on, and that they should really set up camp and stay where they were, hoping that in time, the drifting ice would carry them closer to land. Some of the men were really disappointed, but Shackleton can't allow for complaints. Very quickly, he ordered the team to gather all their supplies and to salvage whatever they could before the ice would bury their ship forever. The 28 men spent weeks on the drifting ice. There was nothing around them but an infinite stretch of white. The cold wind was the only sound they could hear, and the days felt endless and blurred together. Without a clear path ahead, all they could do was to wait, hoping that the floating ice would carry them somewhere new. The biggest struggle at the moment was food and fire. The men held on to every bit of ration that they had, and they hunted seals and penguins whenever they could to survive the long winter. The seal meat could feed both the man and the dogs, but the real treasure was the thick layer of fat beneath the skin, known as blubber. The men would slice them off in heavy strips and use them as fuel. As the blubber was tossed into fire, it would melt into a pool of oil that kept the fire going. The smell was awful, thick and greasy in the air, but it was good enough to boil water and cook a meal without wasting any precious wood. In the freezing cold, this blubber and food would not spoil, but it was easily frozen when it was exposed to the air, so the butchering had to be done quickly. If they waited too long, the carcass would freeze solid. On top of that, the men had to take off their gloves to handle the knives properly, and having bare hands in the open air was a terrible idea. If the cold reaches too deep, their hands could lead to frostbite, turning black and never recover, so the men had to prepare the meat while the animal was still warm, then put their gloves back on before the cold could numb their fingers. It was a brutal routine. Day after day, it was the same rhythm: hunt, cut, cook, eat, and wait. But survival wasn't just about being fed. The men needed something else to do to keep them alive. So on some days, the men would clear a patch of snow and play soccer, using scraps of wood and bits of gear as goalposts. The men would kick the ball across slippery, frozen ground, filling the air with echoes of shouts and laughter, even if it's just for a little while. And then, during the night, some men would gather to play cards, while others spent time reading, and sometimes Leonard Hussey would pull out his banjo, and the bright plucky notes would remind the man of the world they had left behind. However, life in Antarctica was still really difficult. It was a place where you could wear down even the strongest mind. Most of the time, there was no warmth, no life, and no movement. Only an endless white in every direction, and a slow silent drift of floating ice beneath their feet. The cold made everything harder, and even the simplest task could become a struggle. In a diary, it was recorded that one morning, First Officer Greenstreet fumbled his cup of powdered milk and spilled the entire portion into the snow. In a place where every ration matters, losing it really felt like a bitter loss. Greenstreet just stood there, staring at the ground in silence, too cold and too exhausted to even react. Then, without a word, the men around him quietly stepped forward. One by one, each of them poured a bit of their own milk into his empty cup until it was full again. Out here in the cold, the men had to take care of each other. It was the only way they could survive, especially now when all they could do was to wait in the unknown, and having their fate completely dependent on the floating ice. So, if the ice continued to drift northwest, it might carry them closer to land, maybe even as far as the South Orkney Island, about 500 miles away. But there was no guarantee. If the ice was slowly turning east, dragging them further out to the sea, then there would be no escape. To make things even worse, in Antarctica, winter comes with polar night, a season where the sun disappeared for months at a time. There would be no sunrise and no sunset, just a long stretch of night with the eerie sound of ice cracking and shifting in the dark. Sometimes, out of desperation, Shackleton would lead scouting trips to look for a way out. But every search always ended the same: ice in every direction. There was no way to go. So the only thing they could do was to turn their focus on preparing the lifeboats. Harry McNish, the carpenter, did everything he could to improve the boats for open sea, using wood planks from the broken ship to strengthen the keel and reinforce the sides. Each boat was given a name. The largest boat was called the James Caird, named after one of the expedition's biggest supporters. The other two cutters were named the Dudley Docker and Stinkhorn Whales. The artist for the expedition, George Marston, painted the names on the boat with the little paint that he had left. Hurley, the photographer, built a portable stove that could burn blubber. He also finished repairing the boat pump, just in case the lifeboat started taking in water. Some rations were packed, the charts were studied, and the currents and the winds were mapped. All that was left was for the ice to drift them closer to land. But that never happened. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The winds had faded, and the pack of ice barely moved at all. As the waiting dragged on, the cold became worse. The temperature could drop to 10 below zero. The food was running out. Hunger had become a constant pain that never went away. Most of the men spent the entire day inside their sleeping bags just so they could stop shivering in the cold. And the dogs, they were getting thinner, barely able to walk. There simply wasn't enough food to keep everyone alive, so Shackleton had to give the painful order. All the dogs would have to be put down. The men had grown attached to the animals. But no one argued. Everyone understood. It was too difficult to speak out loud. But in a place like this, nothing could go to waste. Then one morning, Alfred Cheetham, the third officer, was panicking and running through the tents. "Crack!" he shouted. "Crack! Let up and stow!" Within a few moments, the whole camp was awake. As it turns out, the ice beneath them had split open. There were two long fractures cutting through the floor. The pack of ice was rising and falling with the waves, and one of the cracks was already 20 feet wide. It was now too unstable to camp on the ice, and if anyone fell through the cracks, rescue would be near impossible. So, eventually, Shackleton had to give the order. They had no choice but to launch the boats. The men rushed to their lifeboats, hacking them free from the ice. They picked up the blubber stuff and gathered all the little things that they had. Anything that could be taken along was loaded into the boats. Then they launched themselves to the water, still surrounded by the ice, not knowing where they could even go. But there was no turning back. All they could do now was to keep rowing their boats. So, it was speculated that by now, the 28 men had drifted into Bransfield Strait, a brutal stretch of water between the South Shetland Island and the Antarctic Peninsula. Barely anyone had ever sailed through these waters, and even the modern sailors didn't know much about them. The currents were strong and unstable, the fog was bitterly cold, and the winds were changing too quickly. It's one of the worst places to be on Earth, especially in a small boat. Now, the boats were not overloaded, but they were packed too tight. The Stinkhorn Whales were carrying 8 persons, the Dudley Docker had 9, and the James Caird 11. Still, they were making decent progress. Throughout the afternoon, they were moving steadily towards the northwest. They kept running into patches of ice, but never so bad that it completely stopped them. Then, around 5 o'clock, the sky was getting dark. So Shackleton called the other boats to gather around and look for a place to rest. Eventually, they found a flat, heavy slab of ice about 200 yards wide. It looked stable enough, so the men decided to land on the platform. They pitched their tents and lit their blubber stuff, thinking that they could finally get some rest. But tragically, this did not last for long. Just a few hours later, Shackleton had a bad feeling. So he got up and looked outside of his tent. And sure enough, the swell had gotten stronger, and the waves were crashing straight against them. Then, all of a sudden, a deep crack echoed throughout the night, and a man shouted, "Help! Help! Somebody's missing!" Shackleton ran toward the sound. He tore through the tents and saw that one of the men still trapped inside the sleeping bag had fallen into the icy water. He quickly reached down, pulling as hard as he could, and managed to haul the man back to the ice. It was Ernest Holness, the engine stoker, soaking wet but still alive. So they quickly fired up a blubber stuff, while Holness was freezing and shivering uncontrollably. To make things worse, there wasn't even any dry clothing to spare, because the men were already wearing everything that they had. So Shackleton ordered Holness to keep moving, walking circles all night just to make sure he could stay alive. After that, no one dared to sleep. The ice was still cracking, and in the dark, it was too dangerous to launch the boat. So the men took turns walking back and forth with Holness. Holness never complained, not about the cold, and not even about almost dying. The men launched their boats in the morning. They speculated that Elephant Island was somewhere to the north, maybe about 40 miles away. The water was rough. The boat was slammed hard against the waves. But after some time, the ice seemed to open up completely, showing the open water. After more than a year of being trapped in the ice, the men had finally reached the open sea. But it wasn't exactly what they had imagined. Out here, there was nowhere to hide. The northeast wind was hitting them really hard. Waves were crashing over the side of their boats, and water spray was soaking them wet, turning into ice against their skin. The cold cut deeper. There was no more camping on the ice, no room to lie down, and no chance to sleep. And somehow, they managed to keep going for 5 days straight, throughout the day and night. Then, on the 15th of April 1916, the men finally saw it. The Elephant Island. All the men were suffering, dehydrated and frostbitten. Their bodies were pushed to the limit. They haven't even been sleeping for nearly 8 hours, but the sight of the land gave them a boost of strength that made no logical sense. They rowed even harder, fighting through the dust, the burns, and the blisters. The distance was longer than it looked, but near the end of the 6th day, they finally made it to land. Land that would not crack, sink, or drift away. So, the 28 men were the first in recorded history to ever set foot on Elephant Island. And when they landed, no one really quite knew what to do. Some of the men were walking in circles. Others dropped down to the ground and pressed their faces against the frozen earth, as if to make sure that it was real. All of them looked horrible, hungry, exhausted, and suffering from frostbite. Charles Green, the cook, quickly lit up a blubber stove. He prepared some hot powdered milk, and the men drank it near boiling. The heat rushed through them like fire, warming the inside of their bodies, making their nerves tingle as if they had returned to life. Now, the beach they had landed on was just a tiny stretch of rocky shore, pressed against a cliff about 800 feet high. It was hardly a safe refuge, but it was land. And for the first time in over a year, they were surrounded by some natural wildlife. There were seals resting just down the beach, penguins waddling up from the water. Shackleton quickly sent out a hunting party, and they returned with 4 seals. Shortly after, the meat was carved and the cook was frying them on the blubber stove. The rest of the men pitched their tents and gathered supplies away from the shoreline. Then they started eating, a long, unending meal. Green kept cooking and the man just kept eating, seal steaks hot and greasy straight off the stove. They did not stop until they could barely move. Then they lay down and finally slept. Their sleeping bags were still soaked with water. The cold was still everywhere. But at that moment, none of it really mattered. For their first day landing on Elephant Island, it did feel like a miracle. But unfortunately, that joyful feeling never lasted for long. On the next day, the men reviewed their situation. The beach was too narrow and too exposed to the rising tide. The waves could sweep them out without warning. It was just too dangerous, so the men packed up and moved again. 7 miles down the coast, they found a strip of land just big enough to feed the team. It had some penguins, a few seals, and glacial ice that they could melt for water. It was just a little more than the bare minimum, but it was all they had. The island was mostly just rock and freezing winds, no shelter and no protection. There's a reason why no one else had ever set foot on Elephant Island, and a good chance that no one ever would. The land was brutal, isolated and mostly avoided. Shackleton knew that they couldn't just stay here and wait for help. So he gathered the men and told them the bad news. Shackleton was going to sail for rescue, taking only 5 men with him in their best boat, the James Caird. The plan was try to reach South Georgia, over 800 miles away, across one of the most violent stretches of ocean on planet Earth, in a vessel that was never meant for the open sea. Their odds were worse than anything they had ever faced before. It was a desperate move. The men knew that they most likely would not survive the journey. Then came the hardest decision of all. Shackleton had to decide who would come along and who would be left behind. The decision wasn't just about who was the strongest, but also about the people that they could not afford to leave behind. First, there was the navigator, Frank Hurley. The challenge was to navigate through 800 miles of the toughest sea, aiming for a tiny speck of land not even 25 miles wide. If they missed it, they would be lost forever. So Hurley was the only one they trusted they might be able to guide them there. Then came Tom Crean, the second officer, solid and tough as nails. He would follow orders without question, but patience was never his strength. So he was probably better in action than in waiting. Next was McNeish, the carpenter. If the boat took damage in the open sea, someone with carpentry skills could mean the difference between life and death. Then there was John Vincent, strong but unstable, so it was probably safer to take him along than to leave him behind. And finally, Shackleton chose McCarthy, strong, loyal, and quiet, tough like a bull and never complained. Shackleton brought him along simply because he was trustworthy. So this was the 6th man, chosen to face the most dangerous journey of the entire expedition. In the final days before departure, the men worked hard on preparing the James Caird. The camp started to grow silent. What they were trying to accomplish seemed to be nearly impossible, and the men started to wonder what would happen if the journey had failed. One afternoon, Shackleton met with Frank Hurley, and they agreed that just in case Shackleton did not survive the journey, Frank Hurley would be in charge of all the photos and films that were taken on the expedition, and he would be allowed to share them with the world. Shackleton wrote the instruction in Hurley's diary and signed the agreement. He even gave Hurley his own binoculars as a symbol of trust and respect. Later that night, Shackleton stayed out with Frank Hurley. The two of them talked through every possible scenario. What to do if the man had failed, how long to wait, and how to ration everything that they had. Then Shackleton handed him a letter. In it asked Frank Hurley to take full command of all the people left behind. and do his best for the rescue of his party. And if they somehow manage to return to England, Shackleton would like Weddell, Lees, and Hurley to write a book telling their story. Then Shackleton ended the letter with a simple line: "You can convey my love to my people and say I tried my best." The crew packed the boat with some rations, some biscuits, and powdered milk, enough to keep them warm, but never enough to make them full. 2 primer stuffs were taken, just in case one of them broke. Worsley, the navigator, brought to Saxton, along with all the maps that they had. The boat James Caird was patched and reinforced. Then it was time to leave. Everyone came out to help launch the boat. They pushed it down into the surf, racing against the cold. There was no big speech, just a handshake and a few quiet words. As the boat was pulled away by the wind, the men called out to wish them luck. Shackleton turned around briefly, waved to the man left behind. Then, on the shore, the man stood there in silence, knowing that deep down, they might never see each other again. For the 22 men who were stranded on Elephant Island, survival had just become a completely different challenge. Shackleton had taken away some of the most experienced crew members, along with the strongest boat and most of the good equipment that they had. The men were sick, exhausted, and frostbitten, stuck together on a tiny stretch of rocky beach with no way to know for sure if help would ever come. The days that followed were brutal. The tents that they had were completely useless against the storms, so they flipped their boats over and turned them into a makeshift shelter. It managed to block off some of the wind, but it was still really cold. And everything was wet all the time. Their clothes, their sleeping bags, and even their skin. Some of the men had started showing signs of gangrene, toes turning black and fingers went numb. One of the youngest crew members, Percy Blackborough, had the worst. His foot was rotting and likely would not survive without drastic action. So the physician, Alexander Macklin, amputated the toes on Blackborough's foot right there at the shelter, using chloroform, sugar, and boiling water to sterilize the tools. The surgery was successful, but there wasn't enough proper medicine. It was just enough to keep Blackborough alive a little longer. Then the men started waiting, day after day, hoping the 6 men would come back for them with help. Every morning, some of the men would climb up to the top of a nearby hill. They would stare at the horizon, praying to see any sign of a ship. But the sea stayed empty, and the days turned into weeks, then weeks dragged into months. The journey to South Georgia was only supposed to take a week, but 4 months went by. By August, the waiting had become a challenge by itself. The journals and diaries show a detailed record of what the men were going through. Some of them were just hiding in their sleeping bags, reading the same few books over and over again. Hudson, the navigator, was getting weaker. He fell on his back while trying to wave his hand. The men were still climbing up the hill, but few of them believed there was anything different. Some of them had given up hope entirely. By August 18, the ice started reappearing, blocking both sides of the sea as far as the eyes can see. Then came the 19th. One line in the journal captured the truth of their situation. There is no good in deceiving themselves any longer. While the 22 men were left stranding on Elephant Island, the only people who know they were there were the 6 men fighting for their lives in a salvaged lifeboat. The sea does not reward courage, you survive wave by wave. And if you're lucky enough, you get to live to see another day. Shackleton's plan was simple: to sail north as quickly as possible away from the ice, and then cut east towards South Georgia once they reached the open water. For the first few days, there was a sliver of hope. The wind was howling behind them, pushing the boat forward, and they managed to cover 120 miles. However, soon after, the waves started crashing into the boat. Water was filling the deck faster than they could bail it out. The floorboards were flooded and even started bending beneath their feet. There was no escape. They were cold and wet the entire time. The lifeboat never stopped swaying. Heavy waves were snapping the boat like a whip, jolting every muscle in their body. No one can really sleep. By day 4, their optimism was completely gone. The wind stopped howling, and they were barely moving, only about a mile every half hour, and every bit of progress felt like a great battle. And because they were constantly wet, their clothes were rotting on their backs, their feet were numb and swollen, and even worse, their navigation books were falling apart, and the pages turned to a pulp. They were trying their best to navigate, but there was no way to know for sure if they were on the right track. Yet, the 6 men kept rowing. Their will to survive is stronger than the pain felt by the physical body. And ironically, what nearly broke them was the times where they could not row at all. On the 6th of May, the wind was too strong. To avoid the boat being flipped over, the 6 men had to drop the anchor and wait for the wind to pass. The waves were violently pummeling the hull, but there was nothing else that the men could do. At one point, even Shackleton, who was calmest of them all, snapped at a bird circling overhead, as if the creature had brought a curse to their situation. Then, shortly after, they discovered something even worse. They found out that the water barrels had been contaminated by seawater. What they had now tasted gritty and salty. Every sip felt like a cruel punishment. The next morning, the wind got weaker, but a thick fog hung over the sea. The men started rowing again, even though they could barely see a few yards ahead. Then, around 10:30 in the morning, they noticed something strange. A clump of seaweed was floating by, and a few minutes later, a cormorant flew overhead. But cormorants don't usually fly over the open ocean. They tend to stay close to shore. So the crew quickly leaned forward, every eye straining to search through the mist. And then, just for a moment, the fog lifted, revealing a dark shape far on the horizon, and then vanished again behind the mist. Right away, Worsley compared the shape against the chart and realized he had brought them within 16 miles of Cape Dermatov. The men quickly rowed as hard as they could, but as they got closer, they heard a deep roar that sounded like thunder. Waves were pounding into the cliffs like cannon fire. The shore was right there, but there was no way in. Shackleton had ordered the men to turn away. That night, a storm rolled in hard. Freezing rain, howling winds, and waves were hammering from every direction. The men barely slept, and by morning, they were so sick of the sea that they were ready to risk everything, rather than to spend another night on the open ocean. So the men tried again, raising every bit of sail and aiming for a tiny gap between the reef. The wind shoved them back 3 times, but on the 4th try, they caught the angle just right, and the boat slid through the rocky curve and hit the shore. There were no cries of victory and no tears of relief. They had suffered too much just to stay alive. They simply looked at each other and shook hands. While Shackleton was sitting on the rocks, he was quietly thinking about the next step. At first, he thought that the plan was to rest, then try to sail around the island to reach the whaling station at Leith Harbor. But tragically, they found out that the boat was too badly damaged. The rudder was lost during landing, and the hull was leaking badly. So Shackleton decided that the next best plan was to go on foot. However, even though the distance was only 29 miles on the map, it was a journey through steep frozen mountains that no one had ever crossed before. Now, the peaks in South Georgia were not the biggest problem. The real danger is in the terrain itself: sharp ridges, hidden crevices, and ice fields that could easily shatter beneath their feet. Yet, it was their only hope. So Shackleton told the crew that the plan was for him to try to cross the island by traveling as light as possible, taking only two of the strongest men, Frank Hurley and Tom Crean. They won't be carrying any sleeping bags, just 3 days worth of food, fuel for 6 hot meals, a pot, compasses, 50 feet of rope, and a carpenter's tool sharpened to be used as a climbing axe. The only other item that Shackleton allowed was Hurley's diary. Just in case they did not survive the journey, whoever found the diary could figure out what actually happened. Then Shackleton quietly put aside Harry McNeish and wrote him a letter. In it, he ordered McNeish to stay behind with Vincent and McCarthy, to live off seals, birds, and fish, and to wait for rescue. And if Shackleton never returned, they were to wait and survive throughout the winter, then try to find a way for help around the East Coast. Then, with the plan in place, the men went off to get some sleep. They slept for 12 full hours. Then, after having some food, under the glow of a full moon, it was time to move again. There was just no point in waiting, so Shackleton and the two men left the shoreline and started climbing. Their first challenge came quickly, a steep snow-covered slope. Shackleton led the way, pushing a steady pace. For more than an hour, they climbed in silence, the snow soft and ankle-deep, turning every step into a battle. Now, at the time, there was no existing map for the interior of the island. Only the coastline had ever been charted. The men had nothing but their eyes to guide their path, deciding as they went. Worried about sudden drops and hidden crevices, Shackleton tied the men together with rope. 3 men moving blindly into the wide unknown. By daybreak, they had covered about 5 miles, and when the sun lit through the fog, they saw a snow-covered lake. They thought it looked like a flat ground forward, so the men went off trying to reach it, descending easily. The crevices started appearing, thin at first, then wider and deeper. They realized they were walking down the face of a glacier, but it was too late to turn back. Then, a few hours later, once the fog was completely lifted, what they saw nearly broke them. The lake did not end. It stretched all the way to the horizon. They realized they had not found a shortcut. Instead, they had stumbled straight towards Possession Bay, towards the wrong side of the island. The men had wasted precious time. In better conditions, the men could have stopped to rest, but they had no tent and no sleeping bags. So if the weather turns bad, they won't have the resources to survive for long. In their mind, this was no longer a search for rescue, but a race to survive the mountains themselves. It took them hours just to undo their mistake, clawing their way back to where they had lost the trail just so they could head toward the east. At 9 o'clock, they stopped briefly for a quick hot meal before facing another slope. The way up was brutal. Step by step, they cut into the ice, climbing for 3 hours, only to find a sheer drop was blocking the way, another dead end. With no path forward, the men had to turn back, skirting around the cliffs before forcing themselves to climb again. The altitude and the fatigue were unrelenting. Every now and then, they would collapse and fell flat into the ice. By 12:30, it felt like the men were at their breaking point. They just had to get down to rest. So they crouched behind a rock, arms around each other, huddled together to stay warm. A few minutes later, Hurley and Crean fell asleep. Shackleton was drifting off, but very quickly, he jolted awake. Suddenly, he realized this was the kind of sleep they would slowly ease into death. If he gave in, all of them might not survive. So he sat up and forced himself to stay awake. 5 minutes later, he shook the others and told them they had slept for half an hour. It was a lie, but they needed one to keep them alive. The short rest had stiffened their legs. Every step afterward was a battle against the pain. As they moved on, the man grew quiet, afraid to see what's on the other side of the ridge, terrified of facing another dead end. As the first light of day crept into the sky, the man finally crossed through. Surprisingly, there was no cliff and no impassable drop, just a gentle slope stretching ahead. It looked too good to be true, so they quickly began their way downward. Then, all of a sudden, Shackleton heard a faint distant sound. It was hard to be sure, but it sounded like a whistle. Shackleton's heart was racing. His eyes locked on the chronometer. The time was almost 6:30 a.m., so it could be the morning wake-up call at Stromness Whaling Station. And if the sound was really the station's whistle, it would sound again exactly at 7 o'clock, calling the whalers to work. So the man waited in silence. And then it finally came. A long, familiar sound echoed through the morning air. No one said a word. The men just smiled at each other. It had been 17 months. The sound of the whistle marked the end of their isolation.
When we landed, they welcomed us so heartily that they nearly pushed us into the sea again.
Shackleton's last journey into the Antarctic was a failure. But it was a glorious failure.